March 15, 2024. Martin Kellaway stepped out of the Land Rover at coordinates his dead daughter had marked on a map. 23 years since he'd been back to the Mara. 23 years since he'd destroyed an innocent man to save his own reputation. The lions were already watching him. Waiting, like they knew. Martin pulled out his phone, started filming himself walking toward the Pride. The other tourists gasped. The guide shouted warnings. But Martin had spent decades making wildlife films. He knew how to work an audience. He threw a rock at the lead lioness. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be replayed across every news network in the world. His daughter's ashes scattered in his blood. The guide's face revealing a truth that would have destroyed Martin faster than any lion ever could. The moment Martin Kellaway learned that karma has a name, and it had been waiting patiently for him to come home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rock struck the lioness square in the shoulder. For a heartbeat, the entire savannah held its breath. The acacia trees stopped swaying. The distant zebras fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the Mara itself was waiting to see what price arrogance would demand. Martin kept his phone steady, watching the viewfinder as the lioness rose to her feet. Magnificent. This was the shot that would resurrect his career, the viral moment that would remind the world why Martin Kellaway had once been the king of wildlife documentaries, before the scandal, before the lies caught up with him. Incredible predators, he narrated to his phone, backing up slowly but deliberately staying in frame. Most people don't understand that lions respect confidence. Show fear and you're prey. Show dominance. The lioness charged. Not the mock charge he'd expected. The territorial bluff he'd witnessed 1,000 times during his glory days. This was pure, focused violence. Her shoulders bunched with lethal intent, claws finding purchase in the red earth as she closed the distance between them. Martin's phone tumbled from his hands as he spun to run. The other tourists screamed. Behind him, he could hear the guide shouting something in Swahili, then in English, "Don't run! Stop running!" But Martin was already sprinting toward the Land Rover, his 58-year-old knees protesting with every jarring step. His lungs burned. The tall grass whipped against his khakis, and somewhere in the rational part of his mind that wasn't drowning in adrenaline, he knew he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The lioness hit him from behind like a freight train. Martin went down hard, his face scraping against the earth as 300 pounds of apex predator drove him into the ground. Pain exploded across his shoulders as claws raked through his safari jacket. He could smell her breath, hot and rank with the scent of old kills. "Help!" The word tore from his throat, raw and desperate. "Help me!" He twisted beneath her weight, throwing up his arms as her jaws snapped inches from his face. Her canine teeth were the size of his thumb, yellowed and sharp. This close, he could see the ancient intelligence in her amber eyes. She wasn't killing him out of hunger or fear. She was making him pay. The lioness pulled back, and for one impossible moment, Martin thought she might let him go. Then her claws sank deep into his thigh, and his scream echoed across the savannah, like the cry of every animal that had ever died badly under the African sun. Blood soaked through his pants, warm and sticky. The world tilted sideways, and Martin realized he was going into shock. Through the haze of pain, he could hear voices approaching. The other tourists, maybe. The guide. "Please," he whispered to the lioness, as if she might understand English, as if 23 years of guilt had earned him the right to mercy. "I came here to... my daughter." The plastic urn. Where was the urn? Martin's vision cleared just enough to see it lying 10 feet away, where it had fallen from his jacket when the lioness attacked. Sarah's ashes. His daughter's final request, the last communication they'd had before the cancer took her. A set of coordinates and a simple message. "Bring me here. You'll understand when you arrive." The lioness followed his gaze, then looked back at him with what could only be described as satisfaction, as if she knew exactly what that urn contained and exactly why he'd come. Footsteps in the grass. A shadow fell across Martin's face. "Easy, girl, easy." The voice was calm, authoritative, a young man's voice, speaking first in Swahili, then switching to English with a slight accent. The guide from their safari group, Martin realized. He'd been introduced as Jacob something, a local hire recommended by the tour company. The lioness lifted her head, acknowledging the newcomer but not releasing her grip on Martin's leg. Blood continued to seep between her claws, and Martin could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat. "She's not going to let go," Jacob said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Not until she's finished with you." Martin managed to turn his head enough to see the guide clearly for the first time. Mid-20s, tall and lean, with the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up in lion country. There was something familiar about his features, but the pain was making it hard to think. "Help me," Martin gasped. Jacob crouched down beside them, close enough that Martin could see his boots. Good boots, expensive. Not what you'd expect from a local guide scraping together tourist fees. "Do you know who I am, Mr. Kellaway?" The question was asked quietly, almost gently. But there was something underneath it, sharp as the lioness's claws. Martin stared up at him, confusion cutting through the agony. How did this kid know his name? He'd booked the safari under an alias, paid cash, done everything possible to avoid recognition. Jacob smiled, and suddenly Martin could see exactly whose son he was looking at. The lioness tightened her grip, and Martin's world exploded into red. The pain receded like a tide pulling back from shore, leaving Martin floating in a strange, cushioned darkness. He could still feel the lioness's claws in his leg, hot points of fire that pulsed with his heartbeat, but the agony had transformed into something distant, almost clinical. Shock, he realized. His body's mercy mechanism, shutting down non-essential systems to keep him alive a few minutes longer. Through the haze, fragments of memory began to surface. Not the immediate horror of the attack, but older wounds. Sarah's voice on the phone 3 months ago, weak from chemotherapy but still sharp enough to cut. "I don't want your apologies, Dad. I want you to do one thing for me. Just one." He'd driven 12 hours straight from his cramped apartment in Tucson to her hospice in Denver, clutching at the possibility of reconciliation. But when he arrived, she'd already slipped into the coma that would claim her 4 days later. The coordinates and her final letter had been waiting with the funeral director, along with instructions that made his chest tight even now. "Scatter my ashes at these exact coordinates in the Masai Mara. Go alone. Stay for 3 days. You'll understand why when you get there." The envelope had contained a second piece of paper, a photograph. His photograph, actually, from the cover of National Geographic 24 years ago. He'd been younger then, standing beside a pride of lions with that trademark cocky grin that had made him famous. The caption read, "Martin Kellaway, the man who speaks lion." Someone had drawn a red X through his face. "Your daughter was very specific about the timing." Jacob's voice drifted down to him, conversational but with an edge that raised the hair on Martin's arms. "She wanted you here during the dry season, when the prides are territorial, when they remember old grievances." Martin tried to focus on the young man's face, but his vision kept swimming. Those features, though, the broad forehead, the deep-set eyes, the particular way he held his shoulders. God, it was like looking at a ghost. "Thomas," Martin whispered. "Ah." Jacob nodded approvingly. "So you do remember my father, Thomas Mwangi." The name hit Martin like a physical blow, dragging him back to his last documentary shoot in Kenya. 1999. The footage that should have been his masterpiece but instead became his downfall. Poachers had been decimating the lion population, and Martin had needed a villain for his story. Someone the Western audience could blame for the slaughter they were witnessing from their comfortable living rooms. Thomas had been a good man, a Maasai ranger who'd worked for the Kenya Wildlife Service, dedicated to protecting the animals his ancestors had lived alongside for centuries. But Martin had needed drama, conflict, a clear narrative arc. When the real poachers proved too dangerous to film, when his deadline loomed and his funding dried up, Martin had made a choice that would haunt him for 23 years. The lioness shifted her weight above him, and Martin felt her breath against his neck. Strangely, he wasn't afraid anymore. Fear belonged to people who had something left to lose. "He died in Kamiti prison," Jacob continued, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of old grief. "Beaten to death by other inmates 6 months into his sentence. They don't treat poachers kindly in there, especially ones who supposedly sold out the animals they were supposed to protect." Martin closed his eyes. He'd known about Thomas's arrest, of course. The trial had been widely publicized, validation for the documentary that would win him an Emmy and cement his reputation as fearless investigative journalist. But he'd never followed up on the aftermath, never wondered what happened to the family he'd destroyed with his fabricated evidence. "Sarah found me 4 years ago," Jacob said. "Tracked me down through my university records. She'd been paying for my education. Did you know that? Anonymous scholarships, always arriving exactly when I needed them. She said it was penance for her father's sins." The words hit Martin like bullets. Sarah. His brilliant, principled daughter who'd become a human rights lawyer, partly, he'd always suspected, as a rebuke to his own moral compromises. She'd known. Somehow she'd uncovered the truth about the documentary, about Thomas, about the lies that had built Martin's career. "The coordinates she gave you," Jacob continued, "they're not random. This is where my father used to bring tourists on walking safaris, where he taught them to respect the lions, to understand their behavior, where you filmed him the week before you destroyed his life." The lioness lifted her head, studying Martin with those amber eyes. In the distance, he could hear voices, the other tourists, probably calling for help, but they sounded far away, irrelevant. This moment belonged to the three of them, predator, prey, and the son of a good man seeking justice 23 years overdue. Martin thought of the urn lying in the grass, of Sarah's ashes waiting to join this red earth. Had she planned this? Had she somehow known that bringing him here, to this exact spot, would trigger a reckoning he'd spent decades avoiding? The lioness tightened her grip, and Martin understood that his daughter's final gift wasn't forgiveness. It was truth. The lioness released his leg. Martin felt the sudden absence of pressure like a physical shock, blood flowing freely now from the puncture wounds. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she settled beside him in the red dust, her massive body radiating heat against his shoulder, waiting. Jacob reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. Cream-colored paper, expensive. The kind Sarah had always used for important correspondence, back when she still wrote to him. Back before the final silence that had stretched 3 years until her phone call about the coordinates. "She gave me this when we met in Nairobi last year," Jacob said, turning the envelope over in his hands. "Said I should only open it after you arrived, after you understood what you'd really come here for." "Sarah was here?" Martin's voice cracked. "In Kenya?" "She wanted to see where my father died, where his story really ended." Jacob's fingers traced the edge of the envelope. She was already sick then, I could tell, though she tried to hide it. But determined. God, she was determined, just like him in a way. Martin tried to push himself upright, but the lioness rumbled a low warning. He froze, remembering suddenly how Thomas used to read their moods, how he could predict their movements with an accuracy that had seemed almost supernatural. The man had possessed an intuitive connection to these animals that Martin had envied, then exploited, then destroyed. "Read it," Martin whispered. Jacob broke the seal with careful precision. As he unfolded the letter, Martin caught sight of Sarah's handwriting, still strong despite the chemotherapy, the same determined script that had covered birthday cards and school essays, and finally, that last devastating note telling him she never wanted to see him again. "Dear Jacob," Jacob began, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion. "If you're reading this, it means my father has finally come to face what he spent 2 decades running from. I need you to know that bringing him to you wasn't cruelty, it was the only kindness I had left to offer." The words landed like physical blows. Martin felt something breaking inside his chest, some carefully constructed wall crumbling under the weight of his daughter's final judgment. "He wasn't always a monster," Jacob continued reading. "When I was small, he used to tell me stories about the animals he filmed, real stories, not the manufactured drama he sold to television. He understood then that every creature had its own truth, its own dignity. Somewhere along the way, he forgot that people deserve the same respect." A gust of wind scattered dust across Martin's face, and he tasted earth and blood and 23 years of accumulated guilt. The lioness shifted beside him, her tail flicking with what might have been agitation. "I've spent the last 4 years learning about your father, Thomas Mwangi. About the real man, not the villain from my father's documentary. He was trying to stop the poaching, wasn't he? The evidence my father presented, the staged photographs, the manufactured phone calls. It was all lies designed to create a compelling narrative. Martin closed his eyes, but he couldn't escape the truth. He'd been so desperate for that story, for the career-defining exposé that would cement his reputation. When the real poachers had proven impossible to track, when his deadline loomed and his funding hung in the balance, he'd taken the easy path. Thomas had trusted him, had guided him through the Mara with the same patience he showed the tourists. Making him the villain had been simple. "Thomas died protecting the lions my father pretended to care about," Jacob read. "And my father built a career on that good man's grave. The Emmy, the book deal, the speaking engagements, all of it paid for with your family's blood." The voices in the distance were getting closer now. Martin could hear his name being called, urgent shouts in English and Swahili, but they felt like sounds from another world, irrelevant to this moment of reckoning. Bringing him to that exact spot wasn't about revenge, Jacob. It was about giving him one last chance to choose truth over survival, to face what he's done without the cameras and the audience and the comfortable distance that let him live with himself all these years. Jacob folded the letter carefully, but Martin could see there was more. His daughter's final words, whatever they were, remained unread. "She knew," Martin whispered. "She knew I'd provoke them, knew I'd try to film it, try to turn even this into content." The lioness lifted her head, those amber eyes fixed on his face with unsettling intelligence. For the first time in decades, Martin felt truly seen, not as a celebrity or a disgraced filmmaker or even a father, but as what he'd really become, a man who'd sold his soul for a story and spent 23 years trying to forget the price. Jacob stood, still holding the letter. "There's more," he said quietly. "But first, you need to decide something, Mr. Kellaway. Are you ready to hear how this really ends?" Martin's mouth went dry. The question hung in the air like a vulture circling carrion, patient and inevitable. Around them, the savannah stretched endlessly under the harsh noon sun, but Martin felt trapped in a space no larger than a confessional booth. "I don't understand." The words came out weaker than he intended. "What choice? What are you talking about?" Jacob remained standing, the letter held loosely in his hands. The lioness had settled into an almost casual position beside Martin, but her amber eyes never left his face. "Waiting. The rescue team will be here soon," Jacob said, nodding toward the approaching voices. "Dr. Kamani from the lodge, probably some rangers from the conservancy. They'll see a tragic accident. Foolish tourists got too close to a protective lioness. Standard story. Happens more often than people think." Martin tried to shift position, to put some distance between himself and the predator that had nearly killed him, but his legs screamed in protest. Blood had soaked through his khaki pants, dark stains spreading across the fabric. He was losing too much. He needed medical attention. "Help me up," Martin said, reaching toward Jacob. "We need to—" "No." The word was quiet but absolute. Jacob didn't move to assist him. "You still don't understand. This isn't a rescue, Mr. Kellaway. This is a reckoning." The voices were definitely closer now. Martin could make out individual words in Swahili, urgent instructions being called back and forth. But Jacob showed no signs of urgency, no indication that he planned to signal their location or call for help. "My father trusted you," Jacob continued, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. "He brought you to his favorite places, shared his knowledge, treated you like family. And you repaid that trust by destroying him." Martin's mind raced, fragments of memory surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. Thomas teaching him to read lion body language. Thomas sharing stories around the campfire about the old ways, the ancient covenant between the Maasai and the lions. Thomas's face when the authorities came for him, confused and betrayed, looking to Martin for help that never came. "I can fix this," Martin said desperately. "I can tell the truth now. The documentary, the evidence. I can expose what really happened." "To who?" Jacob's laugh was bitter. "The same networks that built their reputations on your lies, the conservation groups that used your footage to raise millions, the academic institutions that studied your groundbreaking work on human-wildlife conflict." The lioness yawned, revealing those massive canine teeth that had been inches from Martin's throat. She seemed almost bored now, as if the outcome was predetermined, and she was simply waiting for the humans to catch up. Sarah knew you'd offer that, Jacob said. She predicted every word you'd say, every excuse you'd make. She studied you for years, Mr. Kellaway, the way you studied my father before you destroyed him. Martin felt a chill that had nothing to do with blood loss. What did she tell you? That you'd try to bargain, that you'd promise to make amends, to use your remaining connections to set the record straight. Jacob knelt down again, bringing his face level with Martin's. But we both know you won't, because the truth would destroy what's left of your legacy, and your ego won't allow that. The approaching voices had stopped. Martin could hear engines now, Land Rovers probably, carrying the rescue team across the savannah. But they seemed to be moving away, searching in the wrong direction, as if someone had misdirected them. You sent them the wrong way, Martin realized. I sent them where I thought a panicked tourist might run, Jacob said calmly. These grasslands are vast, Mr. Kellaway. Easy to get lost. Easy to search for hours without finding what you're looking for. Fear bloomed in Martin's chest, cold and sharp. Not the animal panic he'd felt during the attack, but something deeper. The fear of a man who suddenly understood how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. The other tourists are safely back at the lodge being treated for shock. They saw you provoke the lioness, saw her attack, saw you disappear into the grass. They're telling everyone about the crazy filmmaker who got himself killed trying to get the perfect shot. Martin tried to process this, but his thoughts felt sluggish. The blood loss was getting to him, or maybe it was the brutal African sun beating down on his exposed head. Everything seemed surreal, like a fever dream constructed from guilt and old nightmares. Sarah's letter, he said weakly. What else does it say? Jacob looked down at the cream-colored paper, still folded in his hands. That depends on you, Mr. Kellaway. She wrote 2 endings. One if you chose truth over survival. One if you chose to remain the man who destroyed my family. The lioness stretched, her claws extending briefly before retracting. Then she fixed those amber eyes on Martin again, and he saw something that made his blood freeze. Recognition. The recognition in the lioness's eyes wasn't the blank stare of a wild predator. It was something far more unsettling, the measured gaze of judgment. Martin's vision blurred as understanding crashed over him like a collapsing wave. She's not random, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the grass. This lioness. She was there, wasn't she? 23 years ago. Jacob's expression didn't change, but Martin caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Confirmation. Her name is Nyota, Jacob said quietly. It means star in Swahili. My father named her when she was a cub. She had this distinctive marking above her left eye like a constellation. He paused, studying the massive cat. She was part of the pride you filmed, the pride you claimed my father was helping poachers target. Martin's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. He remembered that pride, remembered filming them for hours as Thomas explained their hierarchy, their hunting patterns, their fierce protection of territory and cubs. He remembered being mesmerized by one particular lioness, younger then, but with those same intelligent amber eyes and that distinctive star-shaped marking that caught the light. The footage, Martin croaked. The staged evidence. You used her cubs, Jacob said, his voice hardening. Remember? You needed proof that my father was betraying the lions to poachers, so you created it. You filmed Nyota's pride during their most vulnerable moment, when she'd hidden her newborn cubs in the rocks near the river. Then you edited in audio you'd recorded separately, overlaid with shots of my father's vehicle, made it look like he was leading poachers straight to the den. Memory hit Martin like a physical blow. He'd been so proud of his technical skill, the way he'd woven together disparate footage to create a compelling narrative. The desperate lioness defending her cubs, the authentic sounds of gunfire from a completely different location, the carefully manipulated timestamp that placed Thomas's vehicle at the scene. It had been masterful storytelling. It had also been a complete lie. 2 of her cubs died, Jacob continued relentlessly. Not from poachers. They never found the den. But from exposure, from being separated from their mother for too long while your cameras drove her into defensive panic. She spent 3 days refusing to leave the area where you'd filmed, waiting for cubs that were already dead. Martin felt bile rise in his throat. He'd won an Emmy for that sequence. Standing ovation at the Wildlife Film Festival. Critics had called it devastatingly authentic and unflinchingly honest. The footage of Nyota's grief had been the emotional centerpiece of the entire documentary. "She remembers," Jacob said, watching the lioness with something that might have been reverence. Lions have long memories, especially for those who threaten their young. She's been protecting this territory for over 2 decades, and she's never forgotten the scent of the man who cost her everything. The rescue vehicles were moving farther away now, their engines fading into the distance. Martin realized with crystalline clarity that Jacob had planned this with military precision. Every variable accounted for, every possible escape route closed off. "Sarah figured it out, didn't she?" Martin's voice was getting weaker, the blood loss making him lightheaded. How did she know about the Cubs? About the real timeline? She hired investigators. Real ones, not the kind who tell you what you want to hear. Jacob's hand moved to the letter again. Took them 2 years to track down the original footage, to find the Rangers who were actually on duty that week. She learned about every cut you made, every piece of audio you manipulated. She even found the game warden who discovered the Cubs' bodies. Martin closed his eyes, but couldn't escape the images flooding his memory. Thomas's face during the trial, confused and betrayed. The way the man had looked at him in the courtroom, still believing somehow that Martin would speak up, would tell the truth. The crushing weight of silence as the verdict was read. "The letter," he whispered. "What are the 2 endings?" Jacob unfolded the cream-colored paper again, but kept it tilted away from Martin's view. "The first ending is if you finally tell the truth. If you use whatever strength you have left to record a confession, to clear my father's name before you die." Sarah arranged for everything. Legal documents, video equipment, witness statements. She wanted to give you one last chance to choose honor over self-preservation. Martin's heart hammered against his ribs. "And the second ending?" Jacob's smile was sharp as broken glass. "The second ending is justice, Mr. Kellaway. For my father, for Nyota's Cubs, for every life your lies destroyed." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Sarah didn't just bring you here to face what you'd done. She brought you here to pay for it." The lioness rose slowly to her feet, muscles rippling under golden fur. Those amber eyes never left Martin's face. She was still waiting, but her patience was running out. Martin stared at Jacob, his mind reeling as fragments of the past 23 years suddenly rearranged themselves into a different picture entirely. The rescue vehicle's engines grew fainter, but that wasn't what made his blood run cold. "Sarah arranged for everything," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Legal documents, video equipment, witness statements." His voice cracked. "She was never planning to forgive me, was she? This whole thing, the ashes, the specific location, even the timing, it was all orchestrated." Jacob's expression remained impassive, but Martin caught something flicker across his face. Pity, perhaps, or disappointment. "You still don't understand," Jacob said quietly. "After everything, you're still making it about you." But Martin's mind was racing now, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Sarah's insistence that he bring her ashes to this exact spot. Her refusal to speak to him during her final months, despite his desperate attempts to reconcile. The way she'd specified he had to come alone, had to scatter them personally. "The trust fund," Martin whispered, remembering something Sarah's lawyer had mentioned after the funeral. She established a trust fund for educational purposes in Kenya. That was for you, wasn't it? Your education, your training as a guide. "Harvard Law School," Jacob confirmed. "Full scholarship, then wildlife management certification back here in Kenya." She wanted me to understand both worlds, Western legal systems and traditional conservation. She said I'd need both to properly honor my father's memory. The betrayal hit Martin like a physical blow. His own daughter, secretly funding his enemy's education for years while refusing to take his calls, planning this elaborate revenge while he'd grieved alone, believing she died hating him for reasons he'd never fully understood. "How long?" Martin demanded, his voice hoarse. "How long were you two planning this?" "Planning what, exactly?" Jacob pulled out a small digital camera from his safari vest. Professional grade, Martin noted automatically. The kind used for wildlife documentation. "Sarah's letter has 2 endings, remember? One requires your cooperation." Martin felt Nyota's hot breath on his arm as she leaned closer, her massive head tilting slightly as if she too was waiting for his answer. The star-shaped marking above her left eye caught the harsh noon light, and Martin was transported back 23 years to the first time he'd seen it through his camera lens. He'd thought then that she was the most magnificent creature he'd ever filmed. Now she was his judge and jury. "You want me to confess," Martin said, "on camera. Admit that I fabricated the evidence against your father." "I want you to tell the truth," Jacob corrected, powering on the camera. Sarah believed, hoped, that facing death might finally give you the courage for honesty. "And if I refuse?" Jacob gestured toward Nyota, who had begun that low rumbling that Martin remembered preceded every attack. "Then you've made your choice, and Nyota makes hers." Martin's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. "Some choice. Confess and destroy what's left of my reputation, or refuse and get mauled to death by a lion who's apparently been holding a grudge for 2 decades. "You're still not listening," Jacob said, and for the first time his composure cracked slightly. Anger flashed in his eyes. "This isn't about your reputation. This isn't about your fear of death or your precious legacy. This is about a good man who died in prison for crimes he never committed. This is about cubs who died because you needed dramatic footage. This is about 23 years of lies that destroyed my family." The rescue vehicles had stopped completely now. In the distance, Martin could hear voices calling his name, but they seemed impossibly far away. Jacob had chosen this location well, a depression in the grassland that was invisible from the main tracks, surrounded by tall grass that muffled sound. "Sarah knew you'd make this about yourself," Jacob continued, his voice steady again. "Even facing death, even knowing what you'd done, you'd still be calculating how to minimize the damage to Martin Calloway's image." Martin felt something shift inside his chest, some carefully constructed wall beginning to crumble. She really hated me that much? For the first time since the attack, Jacob's expression softened slightly. "Read the letter yourself." He held out the cream-colored paper, and Martin saw with shock that his daughter had written his name on the outside in her familiar handwriting. "For my father, who taught me that every story has a truth worth telling." With trembling fingers, Martin unfolded the letter and began to read. Sarah's final words to him weren't filled with hatred or condemnation. They were filled with something far more devastating. They were filled with love, and the desperate hope that the man who had once told her truthful stories about animals might finally find the courage to tell one truthful story about himself. The camera's red recording light blinked steadily in Jacob's hands. Nyota waited, those amber eyes holding 23 years of patient justice. And Martin finally understood that his daughter hadn't brought him here to die. She'd brought him here to choose who he really was,